Well, good evening and welcome to the Mob Museum. I'm Shakayla Alvarenga. Thank you for joining us tonight, especially as we celebrate Black History Month and recognize the significant contributions and achievements of African Americans throughout history. A special thank you to the NV Energy Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event and the Las Vegas National Bar Association for their collaboration. We are honored to have two distinguished guests with us tonight. First, I'd like to introduce U.S. Attorney Jason Frierson. As the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the District of Nevada, Frierson holds the distinction of being the first African American in this position. His career includes serving as Speaker of the Nevada State Assembly and as Assistant Public Defender in the Clark County Public Defender's Office. Our second guest needs no introduction. Professor Frank Rudy Cooper is a renowned legal expert and educator in our community. Professor Cooper holds the position of William S. Boyd Professor of Law and Director of the Program on Race, Gender, and Policing at UNLV. His expertise includes criminal procedure, civil rights, and identities, culture, and law. Cooper will serve as our moderator for tonight's event. Please join me in giving both of our speakers a round of applause.
All right, I'm going to take that as a cue to start up. Hello, Jason.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here tonight. It's really an honor to be able to have this conversation with you.
Very glad to be here. Honored to be here.
So I want to start off, my name is Frank Rudy Cooper, and people ask me why I insist on all three names. And what I tell them is it's because of history. My grandfather, Rudolph Ivan Holloway Sr., worked as a barber, as a porter, and legend has it, left school after the 6th grade when his father died and he had to support his mother and 8 sisters. So he set sort of a tone for the whole family. He didn't get to go to college, but he saw my mother go to college, be the first in the family to go to college. And so I always try and honor him with my name. But the reason that I raised that is that we've talked a little bit, and you've told me that you actually know quite a bit of your sort of ancestry. And so my first question for you is just like, can you tell us a little bit about sort of where you came from?
Sure. Thank you for asking. I went down a rabbit hole of doing research with respect to ancestry and found some really interesting stories that were really inspiring for me. One of them was I found out just about a year and a half ago that my great-great-great-grandfather on my mother's side was born into slavery and actually learned to trade to be a blacksmith, bought his way out of slavery, and an interesting story, he had a plantation, and he had workers on his plantation, and during the Civil War, he had gotten wind that they were going to come and burn all the crops. And so he buried his crops early. So when they came, they didn't know they were there, and they kept going. And he ended up being the only person in the region with resources at the time that led to the family's wealth on that side of my family with a funeral home company that's still in existence today. I actually have a picture of him. He was not to be messed with, clearly. And then on my mom's side, I found out an interesting story. My 5th great-grandfather on my mom's side was actually a slave owner who, upon his death, disinherited his natural family and gave his wealth and freedom to his slaves and the children that he had with his slave.
That's
remarkable. And so there's actually a will, a document where he disinherits his family and gives his wealth and freedom to the family that was previously his slaves. That side of the family actually was I think 3 or 4 time great-grandfather to who we now know as Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun.
Wow.
And so to find out on both sides of my family, we had that kind of legacy.
Yeah.
Her actual, I believe it was her 3 time great-grandfather, I have testimony that where he was testifying that his vote was being suppressed, and they were in a majority black neighborhood, but they were being forced to vote against their own interests. And I have a transcript of him testifying to that. So I always say advocating for voting rights is clearly something that's been in my family for several generations.
Yeah, and we're always all standing on the shoulders of giants,
Absolutely.
but you can lay claim to some great ancestry there. So that's, I guess it's in some ways not a surprise, right, that you've come to this position as the first Black U.S. attorney for Nevada. I want to speed us up a little bit, right? So move us from our ancestors to at least recent day, right? So a lot of people will be familiar with a certain rap band that has produced one billionaire and several multimillionaires. I understand you have a little connection to this band.
I do. I was born and raised in Compton, California. I have my mom here, so she's going to hold me to truth.
Good.
Born and raised in Compton, California. I actually went to school through middle school with one member of NWA, MC Ren. Knew Ice Cube, knew those guys. I mean, we all were. A lot of those guys came through our house. I say that I went to school with MC Ren. If he were here, he would acknowledge we were enrolled at the same school. I don't know that he was actually there as much as I was, but that was just that was Compton.
Right. Yeah, and so tell us a little bit more about growing up in Compton. What was that like?
It was, people don't believe me, and people look at me as a lawyer, and I try to remind them that I wasn't born in this suit. Right. It was real. I mean, again, my mom is here, home in the truth. I mean, we had bullets through the house. We had to be mindful of what color we wore. Right. That was real. We were. I was fortunate. A lot of my friends had, a situation where they lived in a neighborhood where they had to pick a side and pick, affiliations. Right. I joked that I was probably somewhat of a politician at an early age because I grew up in between two rival neighborhoods, and so I had to have relationships on both sides because I had to walk through there to get to school. Right. And so I've been moderating, relationships since middle school, but it was real.
Okay, yeah, and we should certainly talk some more about some of how these lessons that one learns when one is young help you in a position, like you're in today. I'm wondering, so you came from Compton, obviously, to Nevada, and I'm wondering sort of what did your experiences in undergrad, how did those help form you?
Well, so I remember I was working and I came around the corner from work in high school and I saw two white men walking across the street. And back then, the only white folks that we knew owned the apartment complex up the street. And so I knew those were coaches. Okay. And they were coming to recruit me. And I had decided I'm going to college on a football scholarship or I'm going to the military. Right. I had a naval recruiter ready, and I was not staying home. Yeah. So Nevada Reno offered me a full scholarship. In football back then, Reno won all the football games, UNLV won all the basketball games. And so I transitioned to college. It was difficult. It was a culture shock. Going from Compton to Reno, it's a big shift. This kid, I had nothing but Dickies and T-shirts when I got to college and a bad haircut. And so, I had some guys that took me under their wing. I joined a fraternity, Kappa Alpha Psi. Those guys took me under their wing. And, I had a goal. And Reno was very good to me, all things considered. But I was small. And I said, I want to start for a Division I football team. I want to average 100 yards a game. And I want to run for a long touchdown. Okay. I got hurt the week I did all three.
Oh, wow. But you did all three.
I did all three. I was leading the nation in rushing when I got hurt. Wow. I got hurt on a Saturday in Montana, and the Cowboys came to talk to me on Monday. But it was a little too late, and so it paid for college. I ended up becoming the student body president at UNR. Yep. For those of you who know, I give him a hard time. I remind him our Congressman Stephen Horsford was my vice president when I was president. And it just created a lot of opportunity for me. Right. And I worked at the university before I ended up moving to Las Vegas. But as much of a culture shock as it was, Reno was very, very good to me.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you already had these goals in mind. Both, I think, the goal of either I'm going military or I'm going, to college on a scholarship. But also sort of the goal of the specific yardage, et cetera. Again, as we get a little further along, let's talk about, what are those some lessons that you continue to use from that? Now, of course, I'm partial, but I think the most important thing that you've done is go to the William S. Boyd School of Law at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could just tell us, first of all, a little bit about how did you end up at UNLV Boyd? Was that the path you were always thinking of when you were graduating from college?
No, if you ask my family, they would probably say they were convinced I'd be a lawyer since I could talk, because I argued a lot. My brother certainly would say that. But I didn't. It wasn't real to me, and I didn't really know any lawyers. All I knew is I wanted to do something else. I was ready to move to a larger city.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine had gone to law school the year before. And I remember thinking, hey, we got the same grades. He wasn't smarter than me.
Right.
But to me, at the time, law was just about research and history, and that didn't excite me.
Okay.
And lo and behold, then you and our president, Joe Crowley, who's now the student union is named after him, said, Jason, they're opening up a law school. I think you should think about it. And so I kind of, on my own, prepared for the LSAT and it just kind of opened some doors to consider it. At the time, I was pre-med, and my dad said, I thought you were going to be a doctor. And I was like, no, maybe I'll sue doctors. I don't know.
Well, you told me a little bit of a story about the med school thing,
Yeah.
which is maybe wasn't the original plan.
Right. That was one of the big setbacks, I think, at least emotionally for me. I had applied to medical school. I had worked at the medical school in Reno for a couple of summers, and I had done a program at Charles Drew at UCLA, and they said, you're going to get in Reno, so we're going to reserve your spot for somebody else. They wanted somebody who was committed to serving the inner city. And so I didn't get into Reno,
Right.
called Drew at UCLA, and they put me on a wait list right away. But it was 2 weeks before school was ready to start. So that was a big letdown. I will say this, we are all better off that I did not become a doctor. I tolerated science, but that was a big setback. To me, I think symbolically, that was going to be the first thing that I could say I accomplished, and no one could write it off as being affirmative action or
Right.
some other excuse other than being competitive.
Right.
And so that was a big setback for me. I remember I got the letter, and I opened the letter, and I saw that I wasn't accepted, and I was speeding home, and I was just racing home, and I got pulled over, and the officer said, do you know why I pulled you over? And I just handed him the letter.
Yeah, interesting. Okay,
Yeah. And
that
he let me go.
worked. Yeah, I hope so. So that's sort of educational background that you had that sort of led you to here. So we definitely want to talk about the fact that you're the first Black U.S. attorney and talk about the career, right? So your career path is also rather unique. Right, you have the distinction of having served both on the side of prosecution and on the side of defense. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, first of all, how did you end up going into defense?
Sure.
Because that's not where you are now.
Sure. So again, my background did not hold law enforcement in a positive light. And so when I got to law school, it was not a career path that I imagined was real for me. I recognized that the criminal justice system had a disparate impact on communities of color. I didn't have great interactions with law enforcement growing up. Right. And so when I got to law school, I enjoyed criminal law. My brother worked at LA County probation, and my mom worked in the court system in Compton. I gravitated towards criminal law because I understood criminal law, but right. I could not imagine being a part of prosecution because I perceived it as the method with which people of color get incarcerated at greater rates. Right. And I had a really, really difficult time. I will say I had a professor, Rob Coriolis, tell me, you need to consider prosecution. This was back in 98, 99.
Right.
And I thought he was crazy. And it just didn't become real to me. I clerked at the Supreme Court for the Honorable Myron Leavitt and saw both sides. I still could not wrap my head around prosecution. Right. Stu Bell at the time had offered me a job. I was already committed to clerk, so that window closed. But over time, and I think being a public defender was fulfilling. It was fulfilling. I found myself being the voice of people who had never had anybody hear them out and advocate for them, and that was meaningful. A large number of people with mental health issues and a lot of other things, but I always remembered that it was the prosecutor that had the upper hand when we got to court. Yeah. And I slowly recognized that that is where the power is to have an impact on the system, is when you're in a position of making those judgment calls and, exercising your discretion in that way. And it's not to mean that you go soft or easy on crime, but it means that you use your background and your perspectives to do your job in what at least I consider to be a more fundamentally fair way.
Yeah, and we talked about the fact I teach criminal procedure investigation, so what the police can and can't do under the Constitution. And I tell the students at the sort of, closing speech that, look, the public defender, their job is to do everything within the law and within the ethical rules of lawyers to defend their client. But the prosecution has this unique duty because they're a zealous advocate, yes, but they're also somebody who's supposed to be representing justice.
Right.
And I think that's important for our prosecutors to know, that victory, as we were discussing, victory might not look like getting the maximum possible sentence, because that might not be what's best for the community.
Right.
I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit about your philosophy of being a prosecutor.
Sure. I am incredibly proud to work for a Department of Justice that really emphasizes doing the right thing. Right. That's a big message that Attorney General Merrick Garland has espoused. It's not new, but I think it's new for lead prosecutors to say. Our job is to seek justice and do the right thing.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. Sometimes the right thing is going for everything, but sometimes the right thing is diversion. Sometimes the right thing is negotiating a case where you recognize, and I've said this for years, we don't, as a society, we cannot believe in that people are throwaways. We can't throw folks away. We have to believe in second chances when they're appropriate. Now, I remind folks, I live in this community too, and I want this community to be safe. I want the police to show up when I call them. But I want the job to be done in a fair way that makes sense. And I have seen it. I go to court and you see in the box in the state system the number of people of color in the box versus not. That's a reflection of some systemic issues that you can't, I think, limit to just the criminal justice system, but you can't recognize it and do your job with that in mind. We all know, and I've seen it from judges all the way down, folks that were able to get away with things when they were youth that people go to jail for now. And one of the glaring examples is, people that are spending decades in prison for marijuana-related charges that are now legal. Right. And the people who are profiting to a large degree don't look like the people who were previously being prosecuted for that. So I think that it just feeds into the notion that as a prosecutor, your ultimate philosophy has to be doing the right thing. You make the charging decision, so yeah, you should win most of the time. Right. But the system is not designed for the prosecutor to win all the time. Right. And look, if my office loses, my office doesn't go to jail.
Right.
So there's a different consequence, and you have to recognize the system is designed to let a finder of fact, whether it's a judge or a jury, make the ultimate decision. You do the best job you can, and you dust off, and you get back to work the next day.
Right. Yeah. So speaking of that, I was going to ask you sort of, what is your day-to-day like? I know it's very different being the U.S. attorney.
Yeah, there's no common day. My weeks are filled with meeting with the heads of federal agencies, generally the FBI, DEA, Homeland Security, Secret Service. I meet on a regular basis with those folks. I meet on a monthly basis with the heads of all the security for the resorts. I meet at Metro quite a bit with various subcommittees within Metro. I'm on a couple of subcommittees amongst there's 93 U.S. attorneys throughout the country. I am on Native American Issues Subcommittee and a Civil Rights Subcommittee. There's a working group, Voting Rights Subcommittee working group that I'm the chair of. So that's a fairly active set of meetings that we have to have. One thing that I do that I don't know that I saw, at least before I got this job, is I try to be present in the community. I was at Durango High School just today. Yeah. I try to make sure that I appear at schools, and I want to show young people the importance of considering a career in law enforcement, but also not being afraid. I don't want the first time that they see the U.S. attorney to be because somebody's being prosecuted. Right. I want them to know that we're in this community too, and so a large part of what I do is trying to be visible in the community where I'm going to 3 Square in the morning. I try to go to schools and different community organizations. I have AARP and the Asian Chamber. There's various groups that I try to have a presence because I tell them, this past Super Bowl was an example of how well we do public safety. I think, having a career and being with those professionals shows how well we are, but we communicate on a regular basis to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we continue to be that, because that's the lifeline for the community here.
Well, that's great. I think about the role modeling. I know some people fight the idea of a role model, and traditionally in our community, the role models have been the people that ran for the touchdowns and then, but then got to go on to the Cowboys, right? Right. But here you're serving as a role model of another sort of an intellectual path, right? And I think that's important for folks to see, especially our folks, not just during Black History Month, but throughout the year.
I joke and say, for those, I'm aging myself a little bit, but for those familiar with the movie Friday, that felt like that was us. My dad worked at the dog pound, and my mom was a clerk originally at the hospital and then in the court system. But that was, who we were.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting, you, of course, are the U.S. attorney and have a long distinguished career in the law, but you're also a legislator.
Right.
And I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about your experiences there. First of all, what district did you represent? What were the characteristics of that district?
So I represented Assembly District 8, which was Southwest Las Vegas, not a majority minority district. It was a majority white district, had more Asians in the district than African Americans, I believe more Latinos as well. But the then speaker, Barbara Buckley, called me out in front of a lot of people, and you don't say no to the speaker. So I was able to find a community and find a way to represent that community in the legislature. So that was back in 2010 when I initially ran. And the district changed somewhat, but that was my home was there, which created some unique challenges being not in a minority majority district.
Yeah, I'm wondering there, in a sense, you're representing the district that you're in, but you're a leader amongst the Black community here. I mean, how did you negotiate that tension, if you will?
It was challenging, especially when I became speaker. It became challenging because the African American presence had been on the historic West Side, and that was not my district. I went to church there. My grandmother, a longtime church member there, and I realized after a while that I needed to be present in my own community. And so, when I first was elected, I had 8 senior mobile home parks who were not used to an African American male knocking at their door. So I had guns pulled out on me. I had dogs let out after me. This was once for my wife. I think she stopped walking with me after the first couple times ago. We heard the dog barking, and we heard the dogs bark getting louder as we were getting to the car. And we were like, oh, let's get out of here. It was funny. Sometimes the dogs would actually be nice when they caught up with us. So I don't know what message that was. But we had a lot of challenges because they were not accustomed to having someone who didn't look like them at their door. But I had to remind African Americans in the community that I am not doing my job if I'm not present in my own neighborhood. But I honor the West Side, and obviously I think there's a misperception that Black leaders only do Black things with Black perspectives on Black issues, and that's just not true. I did not make Black decisions. I made what I thought were sound decisions with the experience of being African American as part of what led to those decisions. And so, we're not a homogeneous community as African Americans, certainly not as African American men. And so I didn't feel limited to that, and I felt like as long as I kept ties and made sure that my perspective reflected my background. Now, some of that did reflect things that had a disparate impact on communities of color, like restoring voting rights for ex-felons and expanding access to the polls, and dealing with, when I started, felony burglary was at a $250 threshold, and you can go to prison for 4 to 10 years. Well, that's an iPhone.
Right.
And so
Not quite.
right. And so, technically, not only was it a $250 threshold, but entering a building with the intent to commit a crime was also burglary.
Right.
So a shoplifter out of 7-Eleven could be exposed to 4 to 10 years.
Right.
And so having changes to the law based on my experience as not only as an African American, but also as a lawyer, as a former public defender, we were able to make some changes that I think reflected the seriousness of the behavior, but also the realization that, that was not, again, we have to live in this community. We need to make sure that folks are coming out as productive members when they re-enter society, and that they have a chance at changing their life. And marking somebody down as a felon is a serious one. And sometimes the behavior warrants it, but sometimes you don't need to destroy somebody's life for the rest of their life, and it just depends on the case.
Right, yeah, I had a former student, Adam Foss, who was prosecuted briefly in the Boston area, and he talked about the fact that the cases that he was most proud of were the diversions, right? That there was a kid who had stolen some computers, and he talked with the kid, and he realized this is a smart kid that should be going to college and made a mistake, right? And then he got to see that kid go to college and go back into the community and be, a strong contributor to the community. So yeah, you've got to have some other goals. When I think about the political aspect of things, it sounds to me like you're sort of in the mold of an Obama, that the way to lift black boats may be to lift all boats, right? And black boats will rise as well.
Absolutely. Like I remember with respect to voting rights, for example, a white woman, blonde hair, blue eyes, testified in support, and at the end she conceded she was a felon.
Yeah.
And I had a colleague say, I use the word colleague loosely, say, you're the kind of person whose rights I want to restore.
Right.
And there's only so many meetings that could have.
Right.
And so it just made me that much more committed to that particular cause. I have a voicemail saved on my phone of another white man who called me and just said thank you because he also got his rights back to vote.
Yeah.
And he said, you don't have to call me back. You don't need to even talk to me. Just, thank you. And I keep that one because I think we need to be reminded of the little things that are making a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure that we get to some other sort of general questions. So I wanted to ask you, in Black History Month, right, what is the importance of looking at history for what, we all try to do as lawyers and so forth?
Well, we're in an interesting time where I don't think there is a full commitment to telling all of history,
Right.
and that's dangerous for a lot of reasons. I think Black History Month is not just the month to celebrate it, but the month to be reminded to celebrate it all year long.
Right.
And it's not just to cater to some particular community or anything. It's because various aspects of our community have contributed to the things that we live with today.
Right.
The inventions, the developments, the advancements in medicine and technology, not just in music and sports. Mm-hmm. And so I think if you are not taught that contribution, then it's not as innate that you respect and appreciate somebody's value being here today and recognize what they are capable of doing as well. I think Black History Month, I think, forces us to acknowledge that history in a way that I think confirms that color blindness is a fallacy. And so I have always, said if I say that I'm colorblind, it is akin to me saying that I am gender blind. And if I say that I am gender blind, then I am not acknowledging the things that women have to do above and beyond to be on the same playing field as men.
Right.
So to say I don't see that is to rob them of what I know they had to get over that I can't even imagine.
Right.
So when people say that they're colorblind, I don't be colorblind. I want you to see color.
Yeah.
Just don't see it as negative.
Right.
Because inevitably, whoever you are, whatever your perspective is, when you walk into a room, there are going to be a certain set of challenges that you have that somebody else doesn't have. Right. Last year during Juneteenth, I looked out in the audience and I saw a white male and I said, for you to be here tells me that you have a different perspective. And I respect that because I see that. Like, I don't think that it's fair or makes sense to deny him of that recognition. And so for me, not telling Black history means I wouldn't have known about my 3-time great-grandfather
Right.
and the story of my 5-time great-grandfather, 5-time great-grandfather. But we also wouldn't know the things that we live with today that were either invented or improved or contributed by African Americans that has enriched our lives. And it's just a function of making sure that we respect that everybody has value. And when you learn and know that history, I think you're, at least in the back of your mind, reminded of that value.
Yeah, and I think when we think about this in pursuit of, right, justice, maybe you could talk a little bit about what might that mean as we go forward, right? What are some of the things that you can do or that all of us can do to recognize Black history, but by creating a more just society?
Well, I think a recognition again that there is no community that's just agreeing on all issues. I think being open to accepting that people of different backgrounds have value in that background. It's interesting becoming a prosecutor. There were some challenges that being African American, it was a different challenge. I actually had someone argue with me once that I could not possibly be a prosecutor because I have facial hair and prosecutors don't have facial hair. Abraham Lincoln had facial hair.
Right.
And of course, some African American men have, challenges with shaving.
Right.
There are other things that people don't take into account.
Right.
I think that, a perception that, you must be a defense attorney because, you must hate the police. My mom and my brother worked in the probation department. There wasn't no hating there. So there were some challenges, but at the end of the day, we do our jobs better. We pursue justice better when we have a collective contribution to seeking that and an open door to talk about those issues and talk about, if this were somebody who had a different background. I think we see it in the federal system, especially with white collar crime. Right. And historically, white collar crime was perceived as being less serious, slap on the wrist. And there's the debate between crack and powder cocaine and some other drug-related offenses that were looked at differently. And I think we're starting to see a white-collar criminal endeavor has a much broader impact on victims in the community. Right. So we have to look at it differently. I think my background allows me to do that. My having formerly been a public defender allows me to not take it personal when a defense attorney does their job, because they have a client that they have to protect. But ultimately, people don't fully realize the client gets the final say. Right. Your job is to tell them what you think is best. But if they don't go for it, you got to go with what you got. Right. And I respect that and acknowledge that. I don't always like it, especially when they win. But that's the system, and I think that having that broad background contributes to your ability to see that and see a different way of looking at justice. Look, and this is not a political thing. States like Texas and Kentucky were doing right on crime years ago because it was fiscally responsible. Right. And so I think that we have to look at it differently. And again, back to Black history and respecting other people's contributions. It allows you to look at it differently in a comfortable way because you recognize some of the discrepancies and disparities that have existed over the years.
Yeah, I'm wondering then, so we've moved throughout history in your family and then through your career and so forth. I know that there are some young professionals in the audience today who might want to follow in your footsteps or similar sort of paths. Do you have advice for those folks?
Sure. Well, number one, this is something that's different. When I talk to younger folks, I'm completely in denial when I say young folks. My beard gives it away. But I was talking at Durango High School about this today. Everybody has social media now. We didn't have social media when I was coming up. Yeah. And so I have to remind folks to be conscious of your social media behavior because it doesn't go away. Right. And as an employer, I look. Right. And so I know I'm not the only one. So be aware that I have always, maybe because, so my mom worked in the court system, so there were times where, a police officer would see me with a certain crowd, and the conversation was literally, You want to go to juvie or you want to go to your mama?
Right.
That wasn't an easy answer. But, I think that I was required to think about how it looked and where I went and who I associated with a lot more than a lot of other folks. And I think, that was just by virtue of who my mom in the neighborhood was.
Right.
But now you have social media and you have, X and Instagram and all these other things that I think contribute to even a greater need to be conscious of your appearances, to conduct yourself as if someone's watching, because someone's watching, even when you don't think so.
Yeah.
And I remind folks of that, but I also remind folks not to be afraid. When I became a lawyer, I remember I was at a medium-sized firm, and I found myself feeling the need to keep up with the Joneses and go buy a new car and buy a nicer suit because that was the environment that I was in. And it could be intimidating, but know that, folks fake it well. And, you all see these billboards and commercials on TV. I went to school with some of those folks. They're human just like us, so don't let anybody tell you you can't accomplish it. Keep an open mind, especially in college, have some fun. Because it doesn't really matter what your major is. And if you have fun, you're going to do well and do better at it.
That's right.
But be serious about it because, and earlier and earlier, you have to be serious about it. So, my kids are here too. I tell them all the time. That's why we're on them about grades. Because you have to be serious. That stuff follows you. And then reach out. Nevada and in Las Vegas in particular is a pretty unique community. I see some members of, or at least former now lawyers, members of BALSA, and you have a community of attorneys that will take your calls, and call and sit down and talk to you about options. I want them all to do better than me.
Yeah. Well, I think that might be a good note to end on in terms of getting to questioning. If there are questions from folks, this is the path that Jason Frierson has taken to this incredible position, and let's give him a hand of applause.
Thank you.
So, how are we doing that? Yeah.
I want to acknowledge some lawyers. I feel old saying lawyers because I knew them when they were in law school. But these are folks that, there are a couple of folks here who helped me pass laws, protecting athletes, people who, when I got this job, I sat down and had coffee with, like, what do you want to be? What's your plan? We live in a community where lawyers are responsive like that. So it's great to see you all here, and I mean it when I say one day I hope you take my job.
Yeah.
It is exhausting being the first of a lot of things, and you have to be conscious of how it looks and whether or not you're going to ruin it for whoever might come after you, and the pressure is there. But as exhausting as it is being the first, it is such a relief being the second. I wish that on the folks that I've encountered, and the law students that I still talk to. I still go back to Boyd, and talk to law students because I think it's important that they see that there's no limit. I will say this. I think I alluded to it. Look, my parents weren't lawyers.
Right.
I grew up broke, but not poor. I believe poor is a permanent state of mind, and we were just occasionally broke. But I had my dad, and I had family where a lot of people in my neighborhood and on my block didn't. And so just know our group of lawyers came from all kind of different backgrounds. I graduated from law school and passed the bar, and I thought, I'm going to go work with a bunch of people whose parents are lawyers. And that's just not the case. Now granted, when I passed the bar, I literally had nightmares for years that I got a letter from the bar that said we messed up and you didn't really pass the bar. But I really want to encourage folks. We need your experience and we need your perspective to do this job effectively.
Yeah, I can just say, as a professor at Boyd, that it's really inspiring to see what the students do. This Nevada's law school, so I've taught at 4 law schools over the years, and Nevada's law school is the best place that I've been, certainly for the students, but I think for faculty and so forth as well. I feel like this is a place where you can do almost anything in a way that when I was in Boston, it was sort of like, okay, well, you know, did your family come from the Mayflower? Then maybe
Right.
you can aspire to be the, you know, U.S. attorney, whatever.
Right.
But this is a place that's open, and people should take advantage of that.
Okay, just give me one moment. I'm gonna come over here with the mic.
You know, as she's making her way over there, we had talked earlier about some challenges. I remember my first year in law school, my grandfather passed away. We were very close, and my grandfather passed away, and it was very difficult for me to adjust. And I got a letter that said, "You're not on probation, but you're close, buddy.
Right.
Like, we're watching you."
Yeah.
And I turned it around, but it was an adjustment. But you know, I just think if I could do it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to acknowledge. I write law review articles for a living now. My first grade on legal writing, C+. And I was like, thank God for the plus.
Hi, I am an instructor for Northwest Career College. My name is Ms. Tawana, or my students know me, Ms. T. It is an honor to be here, like seriously. I have a question though for women of color in your position. How can you help us, being you are not a woman, especially even though you are a man of color, how can you help women navigate in criminal justice, especially women of color that are looking to either get their lives back, you know, on track, or never been arrested, never been involved, but are in criminal justice like myself, especially?
Sure. I will say this. I'm not a woman, but I consider myself a feminist.
Good. Good.
My mom is maybe 4'9", but she was feared on Thorson in Compton, California. You know, my wife is just killing it in her career. Keep in mind that I was the leader of the first female majority legislature in the history of the country in Nevada.
Yeah.
I have surrounded myself with you know, it wasn't at least initially intentionally women, but it was the people that were most qualified and kept me at my best.
Yes.
And so my majority leader was female, and my chair of Ways and Means was female. And the entire, like I said, a majority of the legislature was female for the first time in the history of the country. I say that to also acknowledge some of what I can do is get out of y'all's way. That's the truth. I think that we need to create an environment where folks are able to thrive and they see examples of that. In my current job, a majority of my administration are females. My criminal chief is female. You know, a couple of my supervisors are female, and so I live it. But sometimes you got to get out of the way. I also think we have to, in the legal profession in particular and in criminal justice, just recognize and embrace that there are challenges that women have that we just can't relate to. I say that I don't want to leave out that my executive assistant U.S. attorney who's here is female. I think the first in our office to have to be in that position. My public affairs officer, who will kill me for even mentioning her, but female. But I think that we have to, you know, acknowledge that there are challenges, and some of which we can't relate to, and get out of the way.
Right.
Yes, yes, thank you.
One more.
Okay.
Good evening, everyone. Augusta Massey with the Gaming Control Board. Good to see you, Jason.
Good to see you.
the family. And so my question for you is, you're a lawyer, you're a leader. What is the most important question we should be asking of our leaders today? And of course, lawyers, so compound question. And what young leaders should we be watching out for and supporting today? Thank you.
I guess that's complicated. I don't know that there's a single most important question. I'm going to address your first, and you might have to remind me of the second part of the question. But I think that we should be asking our leaders how they are holding their people accountable. I think that when I was in the legislature, I had to ask for some folks' resignations, and I couldn't be afraid to do that because they were on my side. And so I think as leaders, we have to be willing to hold our own accountable and be subsequently held accountable. And so I think that's one of the best things, especially in this time that we can do as leaders is focus on accountability, but looking in the mirror first. And the second part of your question?
What young leader should we be watching out for and supporting today? Because I know you mentor a lot of people and you're in the community, so who should we watch? Who should we support?
I think leaders also should be succession planning. I think we should not only be trying to be a good example, but trying to bring up the next leader and making sure that we are planning so that when we move on, there are not only people who are options, but people who are, supremely prepared to take over. And that's not an easy thing to do because, it's a hectic job and you're focusing on the job. But I think the other thing that we should be, as leaders, looking for are our replacements. And Augusta, our kids go to the same school. We got to get together. I see her dropping the kids off and she sees me dropping kids off.
Hi, I'm from Canada. It's nice to meet you. And I was just wondering, you said you're on a voting subcommittee. So how is that going? What are your stumbling blocks? What are your goals for it?
Well,
if you can say.
I think it's challenging because every district is different, every state is different, and the challenges are different in every state. So what we are doing is creating, I think, a playbook that every district can replicate in a way that works for their district. So we have, for example, tribal land where they're spread out, and we have both urban and rural. And we have to be able to create a voting system where we address those needs. And so it's going well. It's going well. I expect us to have a fairly robust set of options for folks to report irregularities, challenges, intimidation, any of those things. We're at the early stages of trying to come up with a toolkit that works for every district, at least in a general way.
Hello, I'm Kimberly Bailey Tureau. I'm publisher of Las Vegas Black Image magazine. I'm a native of Las Vegas. And here we are in the Mob Museum. And I've gone and left Vegas, went to college at Spelman, coming back home. I see that Vegas was built on this mob mentality. And I'm very concerned with the cannabis and the marijuana, the legalization, and especially how that affects not just people in general, especially our younger people, but especially Black young men. I know there's a correlation between mental health and the utilization of marijuana. And I was wondering, how do you reckon with being in such a position that you're in, but you see the devastation to the people? How are we balancing that? And maybe going against the system, the dollar bill, because it's the best thing for the community.
Thank you, Kim. It's good to see you. I still have that picture that your husband took of me and my dogs like 15 years ago in the magazine. Look, when I'm no longer in a federal position, I could talk about policy all day long. My job right now is to carry out the law. One thing that I will say that we do with respect to marijuana, because it is still a scheduled drug, and we talked about this at Durango High School today, talking about the dangers of street drugs and the chances of fentanyl being mixed into street drugs and the danger of even accidentally being exposed to that, and reminding folks that if you're getting what you consider to be medication from anybody other than a physician or a pharmacist, you're running the risk of it being laced with fentanyl, and that's dangerous. So I think that's one of the things that we can and have to continue to do is educate the public on that aspect of it. I'll let policymakers do whatever they're going to do with respect to its legality and how to adjust policies. But for now, my job is to uphold the law and educate the public on how that can be implicated.
Any other questions?
I was expecting some UNR on my UNLV.
I think we have everyone. Again, thank you all so much for joining us here tonight at the museum, and a big thank you to our speakers as well.